What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, tonywuerfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Faith Undone, where we learn to deconstruct and reconstruct, reframe a faith that works for today. Last week, I asked you to send me some questions. And you did. I've had over 35 questions sent in, and they just keep coming. And so because of that, I think maybe once a month or so, we'll take time in the podcast and just move through some of these questions. And again, I think all of us, with our combined wisdom and knowledge, I think it's beautiful. We'll continue growing together. And so really interesting questions. And so keep those coming. Send those to tonywuerfel@gmail.com. I'd love to keep getting them. So I think we can't move through a ton of them all at once because they're just really good questions. So I thought we'll just move through 3 of them today because 3 is going to take us probably the entire podcast. And so our first question comes to us from Dallas, Texas. And so here was your question. I thought really interesting because I get this a lot, especially after doing the Sodomites Mishpat, that podcast. So here's the question, and it goes like this. Your podcast over justice and homosexuality was interesting, yet you failed to address God's original plan for marriage outlined in the book of Genesis. I can't imagine God being happy about mankind destroying the institution of marriage that's so clearly obvious in the original plan for man and woman being brought together. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, yeah, I have actually a lot of thoughts on this in regard to this. So first off, let's just consider this. Consider the story in a literal sense, because this is what my friend here is doing. They're thinking of this story very literally. So many people will turn to this narrative in Genesis about a man named Dirt, a woman named Wisdom, and they'll say, "See, God created Adam and Eve, not Steve." You know, it's so stupid. Anyways, they'll say that, and bam, that's their solid evidence, right? Except it's really not that solid. Let's pretend for a moment that this God truly was making a statement about marriage. Think about the implications here. Because if you take that literally, then you have to take that whole thing literally. You can't just pick and choose. You can't cherry pick. So you're taking the whole thing literally. So think about this. Every animal there is given one partner, along with man. And they are to people the planet with that one. So let's consider this. Adam would have to impregnate Eve. Eve would have children, and we're told she has 2 boys. Again, we're taking the story literally. And those boys would have to sleep with, what, mom? Or Adam sleep with Eve and have more children and hopefully a girl? And so then the boys, we have to populate the world, right? Because that's God's plan. And so the boys would sleep with their sisters, and this cycle of incestuous marriage, right? And again, we don't even hear the word marriage, but this partnership would begin, right? Between brother and sister. That's like the beautiful plan of marriage that God implements in this garden. So rather than just create a couple neighbors, you know, in the Eden block, the best this God could do was give them inbreeding. Not to mention the obvious like polygamy that would need to happen in order to populate the entire earth. That's your plan? Like that's the original beautiful plan for the institution of marriage? So now consider this. The institution of marriage. I've heard many say things like this. Well, God created us to love one another, to love that woman and man as yourself, right? So marry only for love. Love just the one person. And they'll, of course, quote the Bible. And they'll speak of marriage today as if it was like this age-old practice. And it started in the garden, right? The reality is marriage as we know it today, this institution where you come together, you dress in white, you have the preacher do this homily, you go through the motions. Yes, I do. I now pronounce you husband and wife. marrying for love, all of this. This is a fairly new construct. So it's not actually until the 12th century that the Roman Catholic Church formally defines marriage as this sacrament sanctioned by God. Before, it was just a way of life, a way you acquired land or familial connections. Love, this idea that you marry for love and you partner together, all this, that wasn't the central focus. That wasn't the purpose. And so Stephanie Kuntz, I highly recommend reading this book if you want to learn more about the origins of marriage and all that. She writes Marriage, a History, How Love Conquered Marriage. She writes this in this book. She says, what marriage had in common was that it really was not about relationship between man and the woman. It was a way of getting in-laws, of making alliances, expanding the family labor force. But as plots of land gave way to market economies and kings ceded power to democracies, the notion of marriage transformed. Now, most Americans see marriage as a bond between equals. That's all about love and companionship. That's what she brings up. Please understand, the construct of marriage today, God in the center of your love triangle, God creating Adam and Eve to love each other from now into eternity. This is all new historically. That's a new kind of interpretation. So please understand, when you say it was the original plan, it's actually a ridiculous idea on many levels. Many levels. So my friend who wrote that question, it wasn't the original plan. The book of Genesis, you cannot use that to say that was the original plan, because that was not the reason that story, that narrative is written. The narrative was written to remind Israel to stop moving through life by not allowing wisdom to guide your knowledge. That was the point of the story, not the institution of marriage and how there was no Steve with Adam and all that. That is just, it's almost bonkers. So again, not the original plan idea. Let's move on. Our next question is from a little town in Fullerton, California, not too far from me. And you asked a really good question. You asked about the cross. And so here's the question that was given. You talked about the cross in a really compelling way. Well, thank you. One I've actually been sharing with other people. When I share it, though, I get the response, yeah, but what about Paul's writings? He seems to write a lot about the cross in a transactional way, like it was a payment. How do you respond? I really like this question. Most people, when I talk to them about the cross, they're pretty on board. When I talk about Israel as like this group of nomadic people who are growing and evolving into greater consciousness, they're on board. When I talk about this group and how they begin seeing themselves differently, yet they're still a people, they still live in a time and a culture, it makes sense. And when you understand this, you understand that these people, they're offering sacrifices to the gods. So the idea of sacrifice, this was nothing new. Everyone was sacrificing to the gods of water, wind, fire, earth. They worshipped and sacrificed in order to have rainfall and good crops and an avoidance of natural disasters. Yet here's the beauty of this. This little tribe, they begin doing their sacrifices differently. They're moving on a trajectory. They're still killing animals. PETA's very angry, But rather than sacrifice their sons and their daughters, these virgins, they're doing something a little more humane. They're taking the lives of animals. And this would have seemed odd to other tribes. Yet for them, they were moving away from murder, away from the barbaric. And so now when you get this, it begins to make a little more sense when you move into the New Testament. You've still got a sacrificial system. The Romans, they're still sacrificing, and so are the Jews. They still believe their gods need to be appeased. But here's the thing. This early group of Jewish people, they're beginning to understand, though, this sacrifice, actually, to them, it's evolved, it's grown. The meaning has become something bigger. So maybe our place is not in sacrifice or demanding punishment. Maybe they're understanding now, maybe our place is in being a living sacrifice to God. Those are Paul's words. We live. And we live out the motif of showing compassion, mercy, justice in the face of hatred and injustice, in the face of the crowds demanding sacrifice. We like Jesus, often find ourselves being, the suffering servant that takes on the blame of others. So when we do this, it actually brings the two conflicting sides together. And this is the central idea of Paul. This is what Paul is sharing to two different groups of people who aren't seeming to get along. So he's telling them in his letters, he's saying the cross, the Jesus moment, the act of selflessly forgiving and loving in the face of hate, that actually brings both of your communities together. The cross brings reconciliation together. And so essentially we've all been guilty of doing the opposite, fighting unfairly. We've escalated violence. And yet he says to this group, you're forgiven. Nothing you've done is held against you. So stop holding it against each other. And so Paul, it's really beautiful letters, but they've just been so interpreted and kind of moved into this transactional idea. But Paul is saying basically the cross is the picture of what it looks like to love in the face of hate. It's a really divine picture. So the advice Paul is giving is to a group of people who feel they're superior than the other, and they're blessed while the other isn't. Their God blesses them, and their God cannot obviously bless the Gentile people. So Paul is essentially combating that with saying, you've all missed it. You've all been guilty of being the oppressor. You've all acted beastly, and yet it's not held against you by your God. So why hold it against each other anymore? And so it's really a beautiful message when you understand the context. So again, when you get that, now read these popular verses in Romans, Galatians, Hebrews, Corinthians. When you start with that context in mind, you view it through that lens, the actual context of the book, you'll see and understand the bigger pictures. It's really actually beautiful. It's trying to bring two groups of people together, and he uses the cross as this bridge that brings them together. It's the moment where you say, look, we're both at fault for escalating violence. We're called as a Christian movement, as a group of people following in the footsteps of this Jesus, we're called to look and act like that in the world. And that's the point of the message. It's actually fairly simple. We've through a medieval church, we've actually convoluted this whole thing. So that's my response to that second question. Now, the third question we'll conclude until next month, where I'll choose another three, and please keep sending them in. This one was interesting, and I have a short answer for it. This last question comes to us from St. Joseph, Michigan. It's not actually that far from where I grew up, so I kind of found that interesting. Here's what they said. I've been following this podcast since it started, but I'm getting a little nervous. You've asked a lot of questions, and I feel like that's dangerous. Why is it so bad to just accept the traditional method and live a good life? Do you really have to ask so many dangerous questions? So my response is yes. Yes, I do. Because I would argue to be human is to think. To rethink, to reframe, to question. Here's the thing, if your church or your faith, if it is so easily undone by simple science or philosophy or some new information of history, then man, I gotta tell you, that faith system is pretty weak. It's pretty weak. And so I would say, yes, we are hardwired to ask questions. We're a beautiful species with gray matter that pushes us to be more and better and evolve. So we evolve in our social ethic. We evolve in our understandings of science, history, the galaxy, and we're no longer bloodletting when people are sick, right? We're no longer smoking cigarettes to heal a cough. We're no longer viewing the Earth as the center of the galaxy. We're growing, we're evolving, We're washing our hands now, right? Like simple things. Surgeries are done with precision now rather than like meat cleavers. And it's all because people are asking questions, and they asked questions. And if I'm going to be a responsible human being, I'm going to keep questioning and growing. So I choose personally to use my 2.5 pounds of brain in a responsible way. And with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. And I hope you will continue asking questions. Continue growing into a deeper, more sensible, compassionate kind of human being. I hope you'll ask the difficult questions and be thankful for the journey that those questions have placed you on. So in response to that last question, yes, I think it is absolutely necessary that we keep asking questions. And so in this podcast, we will keep asking the difficult questions. And we may not agree at the end of the day, but let's just throw it out there. Let's continue the conversation. Anyways, blessings everyone. I had fun with that. And as always, please visit tonywuerfel.com. Give a one-time donation, a regular Patreon donor. That'd be really helpful. And even here's another thing that you could do. And it doesn't involve any money, just a couple minutes. Write a review of this podcast. I realized today I don't actually have any reviews of it. So get on there, review the podcast. That would even be helpful for me. So as always, I love you all. And thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'm having a blast. And so, again, blessings. I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk next week. Bye.